Hello and welcome to the podcast. Today I wanted to talk about psychopaths. A recent article in the Guardian newspaper is titled "More Women May Be Psychopaths Than Previously Thought," says expert. And I think that's a good thing. The reason that I think it's a good thing is because we need to know where they are. And as I hope to unpack for you here, we've been missing them, or at least some people have. And the article features work by Dr. Clive Boddy, who says assessment skews towards obvious male traits, but female psychopathy is more subtle. When it comes to the typical psychopath, the article goes on, people think about American Psycho, and psychopaths are generally considered to lack empathy and guilt, exhibit antisocial behaviour, be ruthless, narcissistic, manipulative, lie. And Dr. Boddy says that psychopaths are after money, power and control. That's worth bearing in mind, particularly when we think about work. And Dr. Boddy's also an expert in psychopaths, or on psychopaths, in the corporate world. And there are a few. While the idea of psychopaths as violent antisocial criminals has given way to a more nuanced view, with Dr. Boddy among those who argue that they're often found at big business, he's not alone. Robert Hare, who I'll come to in a little while, has talked about this for many years. The idea that they are mostly male, however, has remained. Yes, I agree. The behaviour of female psychopaths seems to be subtle enough and less obvious than male psychopaths, and therefore they're not recognised as much. Definitely, or at least not recognised by the assessment tools. But maybe you have worked with a few or for them, and you've known intuitively, instinctively that this person is exhibiting many psychopathic, and perhaps narcissistic traits, and they're female. So if we want equality, yes, let's make sure we identify everyone who is potentially damaging. And it says here that a small but mounting body of evidence describes female psychopaths as prone to expressing violence verbally rather than physically, with the violence being of a relational and emotional nature, more subtle and less obvious than that expressed by male psychopaths. Dr. Boddy notes, adding that may include spreading rumours and lies for personal advantage. And again, let's look at fairness here. Men can definitely spread rumours and lies for personal advantage, and women can definitely be violent. So once more, we're looking at averages, trends. I think I'll perhaps come back to this again, but let me say up front, I think what we're looking at here is a need to consider the character of the individual, whether that's in a familial setting, community, and of course in the corporate realm. It's the character, irrespective of how they look and how they sound. And Boddy says one problem was that part of an assessment used to help identify psychopathic traits, the Levinson Self-Report Psychopathy Scale, LSRP, was skewed towards men, essentially because the first part of it looks at the emotional element of psychopathy, detached, unselfish, uncaring, manipulative. And the second part looked at the lifestyle, which was more antisocial and violent. So the first part, theoretically, shouldn't really differentiate between male and female, but the second part of it might highlight more males than females, is the gist of that, which it makes sense. And the article goes on, there have been fewer studies looking at psychopathy in women than men, and assessors may be reluctant to label women as psychopaths. I don't know why. I wouldn't say reluctant. I think they've missed it because of confirmation bias and perhaps not really reflecting on their subject area. Really, why all the men? That doesn't really make sense to me at all. And as it turns out, it didn't. And it wasn't sensible, in my opinion. Some estimates have suggested there could be a 10-to-1 ratio of male to female psychopaths, but Dr. Boddy's work, using only the first part of the LSRP, suggested the figures were very different. It's almost 1-to-1. he suggests, although also adds that larger scale studies are required. Yes, good, that's a good idea, good scientific approach. It wouldn't surprise me if it was one-to-one. At all. Not at all. Estimates using the first part of the LSRP, this Levinson scale, this instrument, suggests there are about 23% who, although they're not categorically psychopathic, have enough of the traits to be problematic for society, and 12 to 13% have enough of those traits to be potentially problematic. Now, we'll begin to get into this area, which is one of the reasons that I think there's been a lack of clarity around identifying and understanding psychopaths and psychopathy, because we see here that the psychopath isn't categorically a psychopath, but they have enough traits. And how do we categorize? So I'll come on to that in a different way in a little while, I promise. But let me say up front that you may have met some people, worked with someone, been in proximity with someone or several individuals, and you've thought, wow, they seem really quite cold and callous and manipulative. It's like a psychopath. And theoretically, they could go through some assessment and be considered not to be. But what we're reading here, what Dr. Boddy's saying, is that they have enough of those traits to be problematic, to cause us, me, you, other people issues, but not to reach a particular threshold of any given instrument. And I think that's an important subtlety to bear in mind, because it sure as heck isn't a subtlety if you've got to exist in the same sphere as someone who can impact your life potentially negatively. I would also say up front at this point about psychopaths that this is looking at the negative aspects. A lot of people who have these traits, and indeed could be assessed as being a psychopath, are great people. They can be great colleagues, great workers. They're just not feeling things and potentially thinking in quite the same way. But some of them, because everyone's different, including in the psychopathic community, then some of them are downright dangerous and really, really, really toxic and harmful. So let's be careful again within trying to categorize, to not label people necessarily negatively. I think the idea about traits is probably a better way to consider how we should consider psychopaths or those with those traits. And in addition, I'll skip ahead, businesses led by such individuals could lose direction, and it could affect how people viewed large organisation. Newsflash, it already has. And again, going on, so people, you, me, when we view those big corporates, they see greed, untruthfulness, ruthlessness of those at the top, and this undermines democracy and the rule of law. Yeah, absolutely. Once more, this need not be because someone's a psychopath. They could be weak, they could be compromised, they could be greedy, not necessarily a psychopath, or indeed have psychopathic traits, but the psychopath and those traits, I believe, are very much in the mix. Dr. Boddy advocates for screening to be applied to job applicants to help protect employees, especially the higher up you go in terms of seniority. Therefore, you have more power and control, the more those sorts of screening tests and psychometric tests are needed, he says. Again, I do believe that Robert Hare said something similar a while back, so I would agree with both of them for sure, but not everything's perfect. And I think in addition, when anybody's getting into some of these more senior positions, and indeed many positions, any position where people are able to influence negatively or positively those around them, we have to look carefully. We have to do our due diligence. What is the track record of this individual? How did they leave the culture? What was the culture like around them? Encourage people to speak up if at all possible. And also when they get into these positions, we need to ensure that they have probationary periods, which maybe never end. And what I mean by that is they have to be accountable. We have to have transparency. We cannot have the cult of the personality. We cannot have people who become, in their own minds, a demigod. They're not. And that's unhealthy for them and unhealthy for other people around. I'm all for screening and psychometric tests, but they're not infallible. And I'd be interested to see how the tests are designed to get around the fact that psychopaths can be manipulative and some of them are quite clever. So I'll put this in because it's important in terms of the article, which again I would encourage you to read. The article was amended on the 27th of Feb 24 to clarify that the Levinson self-report psychopathy scale is not a diagnostic test, but rather an aid to identifying psychopathic traits. And this is an issue. Could it ever be a diagnostic test? And we'll come on to what I mean by that in a little while. First, let's pick up on Dr. Robert Hare and Craig Newman, who wrote this article, just to get a take on psychopathy from them. Psychopathy is commonly viewed as a personality disorder defined by a cluster of interpersonal, affective, emotional, lifestyle and antisocial traits and behaviours, including grandiosity, egocentricity, deceptiveness, shallow emotions, meaning they can be turned on and off like a tap, lack of empathy or remorse, irresponsibility, impulsivity, and a tendency to violate social norms. Now, you may recognise there that there's quite an overlap to someone who also is a narcissist or has narcissistic personality disorder. And it is often the case that overlap can indeed mean that some people could be described as narcissists and also as psychopaths or having psychopathic traits. And in our article, this is Robert Hare and Dr. Newman, we outline standard methods for assessment of psychopathy, its association with antisocial personality disorder, and its implications for clinical and forensic issues, including crime and violence, risk assessment, and treatment options. Now, this antisocial personality disorder, so its association with, what does that mean? So I want to come on to this article, A Broader View of Psychopathy by Tori DeAngelis. And it says that psychopathy, people with psychopathy have varying degrees and types of the condition. Again, just to sort of mix things up a little bit, this is not necessarily straightforward at all. They say in terms of what is psychopathy, about 1.2% of US adult men and 0.3 to 0.7% of US adult women are considered to have clinically significant levels of psychopathic traits. Now, why are they not saying a psychopath? Don't we have a clinical definition? What's going on? And again, I'll come on to that. Those numbers rise exponentially in prison, where 15 to 25% of inmates show those characteristics. So once more, this takes us back to some of those studies which looked at prisoners who tended to be violent and then when tested, tended to have psychopathic traits or above a threshold on certain assessment tools, which would deem them to be psychopaths. That's kind of where they looked, and that's also where that Levinson assessment focused, which missed, as I've already mentioned, a lot of the females. So this article goes on to say, that said, psychopathy spans socioeconomic status, race, gender, culture, and those who score high on psychopathy scales range from high-functioning executives to prison inmates to people whose psychopathic symptoms may reflect difficult life circumstances more than anything else. So I'm going to highlight here socioeconomic status, race, gender, culture, prison inmate, high-functioning exec. It's anywhere. So to presume that it's one type of person, how they look, how they sound, allocated to one gender is absolutely wrong. It's a big mistake. This has been a mistake for a while, again, in my opinion. And at the end, where it says psychopathic symptoms may reflect difficult life circumstances more than anything else, well, I hate to complicate it or make it a little bit more nuanced, perhaps is a more positive way to put it, but some people would describe that as sociopathy. Some people say, well, a sociopath, it's to do with life circumstances, particularly childhood, whereas a psychopath may be born that way. But other people would argue that's not a good distinction to make. So let's go here, and this is the last bit that I'm going to quote directly from. So to add to the complexity, psychopathy is not a diagnostic category in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 5. It's not a diagnostic category. So this is why I've been hopefully putting a little trail of breadcrumbs when I've said we'll come on to that, and this is why it may be a little confusing. In part, it's due to earlier disagreements in the field. Some of those studying the disorder worried that a psychopathy diagnosis would stigmatise people too much. I understand why. While others were concerned that clinicians would have difficulty in accurately assessing traits like callousness or cruel or indifferent disregard of others. I understand that as well. So although psychopathy was included in the first 2 editions of the DSM, it was replaced in the 3rd edition by antisocial personality disorder. So you will not see psychopathy as something that is a diagnostic category. This is one of the issues. And I think that that's also why if you talk to people, then they will point you, well, not everyone, but they'll tend to point you towards antisocial personality disorder and say psychopathy lies within that. And I think it does, but my suspicion is it probably would benefit from its own categorization, particularly now that we can see that violence may be one manifestation of it, physical violence, but that isn't what it is. And I think we also have to have some way of identifying, and it could be through these assessment tools, like Dr. Boddy is suggesting. It could be through that. But it seems odd that we would be able to assess and therefore, to a degree, diagnose, but not put it in a category that's in the DSM-5 psychopathy, and yet it would appear to me, at least, to be something very important. So that is a debate that's going on, but that's why I wanted to highlight that initial Guardian article, because to come back to what I was saying earlier, we have to be aware of who we have around us, not to stigmatize them, and to accept them as individuals. Someone could be absolutely phenomenal, but as I've suggested, could score highly in terms of psychopathic traits, could go across the threshold in terms of some of those assessments that would deem them to be psychopaths. And you can see how also that could be stigmatizing. But I think, once more, if we take all that aside, what we have to do is we have to know the character of the individual, who is particularly, I mean, I'm interested in who's around me just generally in life, but particularly also those people who influence our well-being, our ability to earn, our ability to function, and of course our mental health. Because if you have people in business heading up teams, heading up departments, interacting with people, and they are manipulative, they are callous, they pretend to engage emotionally, but really what they're after is power, control, and greed. And remember, that's not all psychopaths or people with psychopathic traits, but if that is their character or a large part of their character, we need to know about it. And my opinion is that the callousness and the uncaring may not in of itself be damaging, but if on top of that, their character contains that need, those desires to be in control, to have power for the sake of it, to put down other people, to have a sense of narcissism in there in terms of aggrandizement and being special compared to other people, then I don't want them around. I don't want that character in those positions. And that's why that's an important article. And that's why that research is important. And that's why I said at the beginning, I'm really pleased to know that we could have female psychopaths. What I mean by that is I'm pleased to know, to read that what I've thought, and probably many other people have thought, maybe including you, is that I don't really care in one sense about what the label is. I really care about the character of this person who appears to be causing a lot of damage, who's extremely toxic, and I don't really care how they're presenting. It doesn't bother me one way or another. But what I'm interested in is, are they good or are they toxic?